Hey guys, welcome to our channel. I'm Dan. This is AJ.
Hi.
So we got our step
You
scores
can't laugh
back.
like that.
We got our step scores back in the emails and whatever a couple days ago, weeks ago. So anyway, we've been real excited. We've been looking forward to making this video to kind of share our journey to how we got to test day. We really wanted to give back to the medical student community that kind of helped us as when we were in your shoes. So without further ado, we'll get going. All right, so without further ado, we're going to get started here. So just a little bit more background about us. We're both M3 students at St. Louis University School of Medicine. And in this talk, we're just going to talk about, obviously, what we scored. We're going to let you know. We're going to talk about goal setting, how to make a timeline, kind of the study habits and the resources we used, we thought we were successful with, and how to track your progress and stay motivated. So that's our scores. I'm real proud of AJ. He's real proud of me. And at the end of the day, at the end of our journey, we both put up scores that we can hang our hats on, and we're very proud of them.
Most important part is that we didn't close any doors. All the specialties are open to us, and for us who haven't fully established or decided on a certain specialty, it really helps us kind of move forward in our careers.
Right. And that gets a little bit into goal setting. So the first part of goal setting is kind of understanding more about yourself. What kind of student are you? What kind of career goals do you have? And this is just some information that you've probably seen in one form or another, but take a second and review it. And then again, this is a chart that you've probably seen before. And again, this goes back to understanding yourself. What specialties am I interested in? What institutions I'm interested in? As you get to the more competitive specialties and the more competitive institutions, obviously your score is going to have to go up. So think that through as you're setting your goal.
Yeah.
And that's about all we have to say about that. Set your goals high and don't stop till you reach them. As far as timeline goes, let me just give you a little bit more background. At SLU, M1 year is mostly disciplines based. So we go through biochemistry, anatomy, pharm, path, micro, and then toward the end of M1 and into M2, we get started into systems based. So even before what you see on this timeline, the first weeks and the first months of school for us, we really kind of focused on getting acclimated, getting comfortable, getting our feet wet. We're in a new environment, we're surrounded by new people, we're making new friends, and there's a lot more expectations that are landing on us. So you don't just jump in and go straight to step studying. Get comfortable. And when you're ready, then it's time. For us, we were ready about March, April, May. That's when our school shifted towards systems, and our first systems were heme and neuro and psych. And that's when we sort of switched our focus toward step studying. So we started dabbling in some Q banks. We got some questions under our belt. We would set our goals, and we really had a basic study plan. Moving into the M1 summer in June and July, one of our recommendations is this might be a good time to start sketchy. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then hopefully by this time you've started questions in some form or another, and you want to start escalating, building up to what your eventual goals are going to be in terms of questions per day. M2 year, coming back in August, it's time to hit the ground running. You want to be full speed on your question banks, doing them on random, timed, building up to 40 questions a day, that's a full block, and then from there building up toward 2 blocks a day. For us, this is when we kind of did the first pass of the different systems. So we would go through cardio, pulm, renal. We went through all those to learn them as we were supplementing them with the question banks. And again, we'll talk about that a little more later. Come January, we still had classwork to do. We still had responsibilities. But essentially for us, this was our dedicated period. Okay, by this time we had been through enough questions, we had reviewed enough about the systems that we were confident we could still excel in our classes while our main focus at this point was STEP.
I think an important part now, we're going to start talking about our resources. We're studying about 8 to 10 hours a day, and this is actually our study time, not the amount of time you take breaks, go to the bathroom, talk to people, go to the gym. That doesn't count as study time. So we really try to dedicate around 8 to 10 hours a day. And STEP versus class, I think Daniel hit it properly on the head in that we would only study for class the day before the actual class exam. By studying for STEP the entire time and in the depth that we did, it was very easy for us to adapt and only take up the little details because we had such a strong foundation from all of our questions, which we'll touch on a little bit more in the QBank section. The resources we used, obviously, Sketchy Micro and Sketchy Farm that we did over the summer. We kind of had a little bit of a different approach, so Daniel, you want to go over how you went through it?
Yeah, so I watched it first pass. I watched all the videos in the summer to kind of get my footing, to be able to reference the sketches. And from there, I watched some of them a second time. Some of them I, didn't really have time for. But watching them once is, in my opinion, enough so that when you go to the question banks and you get questions about micro and farm, you're probably going to get the answer wrong because they're difficult questions and it requires a lot of memorization. But you can go back and reference the sketch. And just looking at that image is usually enough to jog your memory. And a lot of times you don't have to rewatch the entire thing. So I did once full and then supplemented the second time with some of the higher yield ones.
Yeah, so what I did is I watched it once through, but every time I watched it, I wanted it to be the last time I ever had to watch the sketch. So I took really detailed notes, and every time I got a question wrong, like Daniel was saying, I would add that question or that little factoid that wasn't included in Sketchy, because Sketchy will not cover all the drugs, and it will not cover all the little facts about the drugs. So you will add to your base knowledge of Sketchy. That's just, I'm giving you a forewarning now, but it's a great foundation. I just added that to my notes, and whenever I reviewed that sketch for the day, I'd just read through that little note sheet I had and then move on. Look at the image, read the note sheet, kind of associate together, and move on. Then moving on, Pathoma and Golion, they were essential for both mine and Daniel's studying. Pathoma is probably one of the best resources out there. Obviously, it's part of UFAP for a reason, but I cannot state how important this resource is. You need to go through it at least once. I went through, I took my notes on the little thing, I drew the diagrams that he didn't have drawn. I added to it. I think it was a great resource. It's just a great summary of how to go through questions and really high yield pathology. Every single thing you see on there is very fair game for questions. And Golion, I thought it was great for passive learning, not for active learning. It was great for after you review the material, just to put it in. He'll kind of point you in how to address a question, how to filter through, kind of how to make your differential and things like that, and how to approach certain things. What are the certain flags and tips on certain topics? But I think going through that maybe a couple times, just passive learning while you're working out on road trips like I think Daniel did, and things like that, really help kind of just keep you learning even in times you're not, when you're doing laundry and things like that.
Yeah. So if you haven't heard of Golion, it's strictly audio tapes, whereas Pathoma is kind of recorded PowerPoint lectures, and then he also sends you a little textbook to go along with it.
Golion may become a little bit difficult because sometimes he references images that you can't see on the YouTube video series, but you kind of just go past that and kind of just take it for what it's worth. It's just a little bit of passive learning while you're in your downtime. RX videos and first aid. First aid, obviously, for me was essential. For Daniel, not so much. I went through and I would watch all the RX videos, and those are kind of like the videos that you can buy in a bundle with the questions, and I would go through, add the details, because if you've ever looked at first aid, you know that it's more like an outline, and you need kind of like the glue between the outline to make sense of it, and that's the RX videos for me. After I'd get a question wrong, I'd also add to my first aid so that I'd keep going back to those questions and those pages that I got wrong, go over them multiple times, so it kind of like burned it into my head almost. Certain pages you'll find very high yield, and by the time test comes, you can probably write it yourself.
Yeah, and then finally, Physiology is a textbook written by Linda Costanzo, and I honestly think this was my secret weapon. She really explains physiology well, and it's so important to understand normal before you understand abnormal. Most of the test is pathology, what happens when things goes wrong. People go to the doctor when they're sick, not when they're healthy. So you need to understand pathology to pass the test, but you need that foundation in physiology, and I really think combining Costanzo with Pathoma, the way each of them teach, it helped me understand the first principles, it helped me understand the concepts that I needed in order to succeed on the test. And because of that, it took a lot of the burden off of memorization, and that's a really important point for me. So like AJ alluded to, I didn't really use first aid. I didn't feel like I had to because I understood, the first 2 years of medical school as well as I thought I could have. From the physiology and pathology standpoint, the details just kind of fell into place, and I could absorb them very quickly because I had a great framework, I had a great foundation.
Physiology, do not sleep on it. It is definitely the key to both of our successes. I wish I would have read Costanza a little more. I kind of had to pick up physiology along the way, but we both scored in the 100th percentile when it came for our MBME on physiology, and I think that was really the key to our success, because if you know what is normal and what relates to that being normal, you will know when something is abnormal and kind of how everything else reacts in turn. It's really important. Next, let's go on to QBanks, I think.
Yeah. So just a second before we move on, you don't have to use any of these resources. People go without using Sketchy. Most people use Sketchy, but some people don't, and they do just fine. I didn't use First Aid. Some people don't use Pathoma. I really recommend Pathoma, but some people don't.
Very highly.
Most people don't use Costanza Physiology. I really recommend it. If you don't use that, find a good resource for physiology. It's really important to understand things, not simply memorize them. Okay, moving on to QBanks. QBanks are the absolute essential gold. They are the secret weapon. They are the secret to our success, hands down. I can say that.
We went through a little bit more questions than your average student, that was definitely beneficial to us. We had seen certain questions 4 or 5 times by the time the test came.
By the time we were finished, I had close to 14,000 practice questions under my belt. AJ had close to 10,000. And I'll take a second to kind of walk you through my strategy, timeline-wise, as I went through these different QBanks. I think I had a pretty good system. So I started out with past tests. This was toward the end of my M1 year and into the summer between M1 and M2. And honestly, I just kind of fell into this because they had a free trial, kind of a beta version. And so it was good to get my feet wet, understand how things are going to be asked, understand that the test is going to ask you to draw conclusions that aren't necessarily there. The test is going to require multi-step reasoning, secondary and tertiary reasoning to answer the questions, rather than just regurgitating information, which unfortunately you might be used to from undergrad courses, or even, hopefully not, but maybe your medical school courses. So definitely important to start the QBanks early. Don't be discouraged if you do really, really poorly. I mean, we started out in like 30%, 40%, 50% range. That's normal. It's such a different way to learn. It's a different way to apply the information that you have.
I do also recommend going on random. You will see things you will never see, and that's important to understand that that's a part of learning. And I think it really helped us on the test because we knew, people had always told us you're going to see things you've never seen before. But we had been seeing things we'd never seen before the entire time. We had put ourselves in that situation and practiced how you perform. That kind of helped us out. Seeing something that we didn't know, we kind of had to use that one little piece of knowledge that we did know to kind of angle ourselves in a question or understand things. And that's why physiology really helped, is that we knew what was normal.
It really helps develop your critical thinking skills when you arrive at a question that you don't know the answer to. Okay, when that happens, especially when you're just beginning, stop, take a step back, read through it again, tell yourself what you do know, and try to use everything you know to figure out the answer, okay? Because that's going to be with you all the way up until test day. You're going to be seeing things that you don't know, and you're going to have to use your critical reasoning skills to figure out the answer. And that's what separates a good test taker from a great test taker. So moving on, I'll talk a little bit about my strategy with the individual question banks. What I recommend is about the time you start M2 year, at least for us when we do systems, having 2 question banks running simultaneously. So what I did is I used USMLE RX on random from the very beginning, and in addition to that, I used the Kaplan QBank, but I did it by subject. So when SLU was doing the cardiology unit, I did all the cardiology questions in Kaplan. It is important to really focus on a subject or a system and learn that well the first time, but it's also important spaced repetition, seeing things you haven't seen, things that might be old, you might have learned it last year. It's very important to do questions on random throughout your study period. And then on top of that, you can supplement it with subject-specific questions. That's how I did it. Moving on from that, I used AMBOSS a little bit to fill the gap between RX and Kaplan, and then to UWorld. I didn't finish AMBOSS. It's really challenging, so especially on AMBOSS, don't be discouraged by low percentages. That's my take on that. And moving on to UWorld, it is by far your best resource, by far the gold standard. You must get UWorld. If you get nothing else, get UWorld and get other question banks, but definitely UWorld. and save it until you get close to dedicated. Maybe not in dedicated because there's a lot of questions, almost 3,000. But I started it about 4 months before my exam. That gave me just enough time to finish it. And what I'm going to say about all of the question banks, take your time, okay? When I started out on UWorld, it took me an hour to do a 40-minute block, doing on timed, on random, which I recommend. And then when I started out, it took me about 7 hours to review that block. So that's my whole day. I might only get to one 40-question block in a day. But the point is that you want to treat every question like it's the last time you're going to see the question. And you do not want to move on until you feel like you understand what's going on, you understand what they're asking, how they're asking it, what conclusions they're asking you to make, and the details that are required to get you from the question to the answer. That is essential.
I think adding on to that is that you need to understand also, there were many times that me and Daniel would even have discussions on how did you come to this answer? Mm-hmm. And having a process of how to get through questions, what do you look for, what are the keywords and things like that, but how your own mind thinks, understanding that is a huge part of your success. Having someone to kind of bounce those ideas off of, and when they get it right and you get it wrong, is very important. Not saying, oh, I didn't get it right because I was wrong, but like, what did they know? What was that one detail that differentiated the two facts?
Step one is not a test of rote memorization. Okay, it is a test of application of the information you have to novel situations. And the best practice you're going to get with that is Q banks, okay? All of them are useful. These are the ones we chose. UWorld is the best, save it for last. And it goes back to the physiology, the pathology, understanding the concepts so that you can apply that information when the time comes. Another thing, we didn't do repeat questions. Some people swear by it. Some people go through UWorld 3 times over. In my opinion, the second and third time, you just remember the answer, and you don't get that same critical thinking process that's so important on test day.
And a lot of these Q banks will have really similar questions, so you'll see a question asked 4 or 5 times, maybe a little bit twist on it, but that's something to really pick up. And if you really if you look at a question and you get it wrong second time, that probably means that you probably didn't take the time to learn it the first time around.
Absolutely.
And that means that something is wrong with the way you're addressing it, and I think you should probably take a little bit more time, review, and maybe add different resources, take a different resource out.
Some explanations are better than others on these questions. So there are times on most questions where you have to cross-reference. And again, I would use Costanzo for physiology. I would even look stuff up in Robbins for pathology if I needed to. But it's definitely a good skill to have, to be able to cross-reference and see how other people are explaining these concepts. Because you just need to find a way that you understand it, and sometimes that takes multiple tries. Before we move on, the NBME forms, take all that are available to you. They are retired questions from actual step 1. Okay, they're the code gold standard with UWorld, and they're especially good as a diagnostic tool, so you can see where you are, if you're on track to your goal. Take a baseline probably a little bit before dedicated, and then save most of them for dedicated time.
Yeah. Resources we didn't use. We didn't really like the idea behind Anki. We thought we would memorize too many of the flashcards. We know a lot of our classmates that kind of fell into this trap, and some classmates that really use this as kind of a review. So along with the things we did, one of our friends, he did all those things that we did, all the Q banks, but he used, after learning it the first time, he used Anki just to keep the memory fresh, kind of like another add-on layer, and it worked well for him, but it wasn't the foundation. I don't suggest learning from Anki.
Right.
I think Anki might be a good review tool for some people, but do not learn from Anki. You need to learn from an actual foundational source. I think that works a little bit better.
Right.
Boards and Beyond is basically a different, maybe a little more detailed version of RX. I don't think that you're going to have more or less. I just like RX because it aligns with the first aid perfectly for me, and number 2, I didn't want to pay more for a Q bank separate from the Boards and Beyond series, so I got a bundle deal. Whichever you prefer. Obviously, Boards and Beyond is a little more detailed, but I felt like I got all those details by doing the questions. BRS, Firecracker, Najib, we didn't really use any of those resources. Our school paid for Firecracker. We didn't find that helpful. We found that even less useful than Anki, and I think Dr.
So-
Najeeb lectures,
Yeah.
they are what they are.
So we're not discouraging spaced repetition when we say we personally chose not to use Firecracker and Anki, but from our perspective, we get all the spaced repetition we need from doing questions on random in multiple question banks. Okay, and we get the spaced repetition plus we get the critical thinking skills and the reasoning skills to get from question to answer, using the details along the way, using the facts along the way. And by the time we reached, dedicated period and to test day, we had most of the facts in our brain and we had them in a good framework, so they were ready to use. And essentially, we didn't need Anki. And then you see at the bottom there, I didn't use first aid. I thought I had a good enough framework with Phys and Path that, the question banks were all the details I needed. And then about maybe 2 weeks before the exam, I kind of skimmed through first aid just to see if there were any huge holes in my learning. And, I was confident that I had seen just about everything in first aid in the form of a question. So I'm very comfortable with that.
All right, and really important is to track your progress. I think knowing where you started, obviously we did not start off with stellar 270s, 260s, and things like that. That was just not us. You start from bottom. When we tell you we started from 30, 40, 50% on practice tests, that was truth. And obviously certain people progressed a little bit at a different pace than I did. I kind of had to really ramp it up and push myself towards the end or mid when I started seeing that I wasn't making the progress I wanted to see. And I think it's very important to track your progress, because if I would have kept doing what I was doing and being distracted, I think that I wouldn't have made the progress I did. And by tracking my progress, by having peers to kind of track that progress against, like Daniel, I realized that I wasn't where I wasn't performing to my potential, and I think it really helped. So if these tables kind of help you kind of track your progress throughout your year, hopefully they do. Maybe you can compare to us, or you can email us or contact us. You feel free. Obviously, everyone progresses at their own rate, but it's just nice to know that there are certain things, like if you have a group of friends, to kind of at least one or two people to kind of who you're studying with track alongside, so that you don't feel like what you're doing is you're lost towards your goal.
And before we move on, I'm just going to address one of the criticisms that I've gotten on my study plan, and I've been told that I started too early because I reached a plateau at the end. As you can pretty clearly see on that left graph, there is a major plateau. But I absolutely do not think that is a bad thing, because when you start to get to those higher end scores, hopefully when you start to reach your goal, the points become harder and harder to come by, and you get the law of limiting return, where there just aren't enough questions that you can get right and add on to your score to get those points. So I didn't look at it as reaching a plateau. I looked at it as becoming more consistent.
So lowering your margin of error.
Right. So by the end of the study period, I was pretty confident walking into an NBME form, or even walking into step one on my test date, that my range was about 265 to 275. That was the plateau I hit, but I was confident the further I went along that I was going to score in there and I wasn't going to take a major drop. So don't try to time it, don't try to hit your peak perfectly. Reach your plateau. As long as your plateau is above your goal, that's good. That means you can walk into the test center with confidence, which is one of the most important things on test day.
So as we're talking about that margin for error, what we were kind of looking at, obviously my range is around 250 to 260, Daniel's around 265 to 270. That's about where we landed, right where we expected.
Yep.
Staying motivated.
It can be a challenge, okay? Try not to get discouraged. You're going to have ups and downs the entire journey. You're going to be fatigued. A lot can happen. Yeah.
I think having a group, we had a group of around 8 people. They all did really well. We all kind of kept each other motivated and things like that. But having other people to kind of go through that struggle with you, people that you kind of meet during medical school or before, if you're lucky enough to do that, then that you can trust, really help motivate each other, keep each other on track. Mm-hmm. If you don't understand the concept, you can go to them, type of thing. But having peers to go through it with is that you can trust. There's going to be a lot of people in your classes that you're going to be like, I don't want to share my score with them. and that's fine. You don't have to share your score with anybody. Your score is for you. But at the same time, staying motivated, it kind of helps to have someone to kind of be your battle buddy,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
And what I like to say is, find your own motivation. Everybody has a different motivation. For AJ and I, we are very intrinsically competitive, and we're competitive with each other in kind
Just
of a
a little
playful way. But like, we really wanted to tear this test apart just for the sake of getting that grade score and seeing what we were capable of. And at the end of the day, we did it, and that is what kept us going a lot of the way. So, if that's your motivation, that's great, but it doesn't have to be. If you're aiming for a really competitive specialty, that's motivation. If you want to go to a certain institution, maybe in your hometown, especially if it's in California or something, that's motivation. Okay, there's all kinds of different things to motivate you. Find what works for you, stay consistent, remind yourself what you're working toward. Step one is not the final goal. Okay, your career and your life is the ultimate goal. Step one is just a hurdle that you have to get past. Okay, keep that in mind and use that to motivate you.
I really found it helpful. It's very important to, as Daniel will touch on it later, is to keep other things in your life. I know everyone says that, but I would go home and I would still shadow physicians and go to see patients or volunteer, because I felt seeing patients and seeing what I wanted to do, be a physician, how that felt, even as just like a medicine shadowing, having that goal in mind and seeing that actualized helped me kind of refresh. It kind of gave me that second wind, saying, okay, I want to be here one day. I want to work with this person, or I want to help this patient population. And working with those people kind of gives you that next level of strength where you're like, because looking at a book in a room alone for 8 hours, or looking at a computer screen, it's grueling. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be fun. Your friends that aren't in medical school, that we post you on the Instagram, traveling, things like that. And that's hard when you're sitting in the same library for a year at a time. It sometimes is not the most fun thing to do, but having those moments where you go, why am I doing this? And having whatever it is. If it is working more in other settings, go for it. If it's volunteering, if it's playing sports or whatever, if it's talking to your family, do what you need to do to stay motivated. But this is not something that you can rush. As we said, take your time and put in the work. And we believe you can do it. Last thoughts and recommendations and regrets.
Yeah. So I'll go ahead and start. Study habits-wise and resources-wise, I really have one major regret. There were a couple of products that I started and, got a quarter of the way through, got halfway through, and I, put them down and never looked at them again because I didn't think they were great resources. But I really wish I had known from the beginning which resources were going to work for me, and obviously, it's impossible to know. So hopefully, you take our recommendations, but it's definitely better to see a product through, see a question bank through, rather than picking one up and not finishing it. So that was my only study regret.
I think certain times I took my percentages very seriously. I would fluctuate a lot, especially during the final days. There'd be days going up to it, seeing my score, you probably wouldn't think about it, but my UL percentage would sometimes go to like a 65 or 72, and I would be, for some people that might be great, and that's fine, but I was at a point where I was averaging well above that, and it would really shake me, and I'd say, I know I can do better, and I'd get really frustrated in a room one day. I think knowing where you are and having confidence, again, looking at the long-term progression of where you are, what you know, and things like that, really puts it in perspective. I got better towards the end, but there were times along the way where I was just frustrated where I was at. Obviously, throughout the earlier half, I was not making the same amount of progress as Daniel or my other friends. But I figured out early, because I was tracking that long-term progression, that I had to change something. And again, tracking your progress so you know when you need to change something is very important, because this is something you can't do over. As much as I wish you could, you can't, so put your best effort forward. As far as lifestyle goes, I think, Daniel, you want to talk about that real quick?
Yeah, one thing before we move on to that, study-wise, like we keep saying, take your time on your resources, but what comes along with that is you're going to fall behind, because like I was saying earlier, sometimes it took me 7 hours to review a question block. When you're making your study schedule, build in catch-up times. Take a day off per week just to catch up on the things that you're feeling overwhelmed with. it'll help with your mental health, and it will help with your progress toward your goal.
Because things are going to come up during the week. Someone's going to say, hey, can you do this for me, this project or this research thing? On that note, do not overwhelm yourself. I took on multiple research projects. I tried to do a lot of things through my school at the same time, volunteer. And at certain points, I felt a little bit overwhelmed. Obviously, now that I'm through that portion, I'm happy for it. But I think that really to keep yourself in a good place, it's important to balance and be able to say no when you have to, but also be able to, I still think branching out and doing a little bit of research, doing some volunteering is very important for your development.
Right. If there's an experience that you really want to do, something you're really interested, don't let studying prevent you from doing something you want to. I mean, remember, the ultimate goal is your career and the rest of your life. It's not this one test, okay? So research opportunities, we both were very involved in research. We both were very involved in volunteering, okay? Those are also important. Don't sacrifice everything else in your life just to study, okay?
Those things
Think
might have
it
to
through,
take a
yeah.
little bit of a back burner role, as in like if you were putting 4 hours of research during your M1 year because you had a lot of time, maybe you can only devote 2 hours, but don't completely eliminate those things. Those things are very important, keeping things balanced, because when you're looking at the same questions, you don't want to be studying for 12, 14 hours a day. I know people who have done it, and I don't think they're very happy. They were very happy during that time. I think they did well on the tests, but I think there's a better way to go about it. Spacing out, making a schedule, sticking to a routine, help you succeed and keep your level along the way. And obviously your support group, very important.
Yeah, so my final thoughts, be consistent, start early. That will help you take on other experiences as they come up, and you won't feel like you're getting behind. Questions, you know, build a foundation and hammer away at the questions, okay? Get good at those. That's what your score is going to reflect, how good you are at answering questions correctly.
Yeah, and you'll hear stories about people who study for 1 week, 2 weeks, and get 250, 260, and things like that. I think we're not saying that that's not possible, but hard work begets more consistent results. That's all we're going to try to tell you. That's my closing thought, is that if you work hard, you can close that margin of error, and you can more accurately know where you stand.
There's no substitute for hard work. Okay, set your goals high. Don't stop till you get there. It's a long road, but when you get the score you want, it's worth it. And when it pays off career-wise, it'll be worth it.
All right, good luck.
Good luck.